It's week 17, and everything that has happened up to this point doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter how many injuries you've had. It doesn't matter how lucky you may have gotten in some matchups. It doesn't matter if you snuck into the playoffs as one of your last seeds, or if you dominated the competition all season long and came in as the #1 seed. Everything is reset this week. All bets are off, and you are one win away from securing a fantasy championship, domination over your friends, and of course, the ability to tell everybody in your league, "Suck it!" Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? If you're tuned in right now, more than likely that means you're playing for a fantasy championship here in week 17. Congratulations on making it this far, but the job isn't done yet. We've got another week of research and preparation to bring home that championship. And today, I have got my entire start and sit analysis for every matchup for the running back position here in week 17. Now, this is the point of the season where a lot of people start to get worried that they're going to be missing players who might be sitting because playoff spots have been locked up. Well, the good news is we're not really going to experience that here in week 17 based on what I'm seeing. So we should be able to run out our best lineup possible. But before we jump into all the analysis, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, turn on the bell notification so you know whenever we drop new content, and let's hop into Thursday Night Football with the Jets and the Browns. Last week, I had Breece Hall inside my top 24 running backs, and I had him listed as a start, but I was pretty low on him considering what we had seen from him in the weeks prior. But I don't think anybody saw the huge performance coming from him that landed him as the RB1 last week. Not only was Breece Hall running efficiently and well on the ground, but he saw 16 targets in the passing game, more targets than he has seen all season long. He hadn't even seen a game with double-digit targets before this. And outside of week 14, he hadn't really done anything for fantasy owners in quite some time. In week 14, he was the RB2, but a lot of that was based on just work in the passing game alone. He had a few big plays there and a touchdown that propped him way up there, but everything that we had seen since really week 8, the last time he was a top 10 running back, showed us that he was super risky. Now, here's the biggest issue we run into. You're playing Breece Hall this week because if you've made it this far, I'm going to be willing to bet you don't have a whole lot of options that you could even start over him. And coming off the week that he had last week, I would absolutely be putting him in my lineup. But it's not the easiest matchup in the world. And once again, I think he's going to have to make his mark in the passing game in order to give you top 10 potential. Right now, Cleveland is still ranked 10th against the run, allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. So, are we putting Breece Hall in our lineup? Absolutely. But I'm going to be willing to bet that a performance just outside the top 12 is more likely than an RB1 performance again this week. If you've been looking for a guy to give you mid to low end RB2 performances, then Jerome Ford has been your guy since week 7. He's had one performance as the RB14, 2 is the RB17, and a whole lot of performances where he's barely clearing the top 24 or just finishing outside of it. But this week sets up nicely to let him have another one of those high-end RB2 performances. He's had some tougher matchups. The Rams, Jacksonville, Chicago, Houston, all of those teams have done a really good job against running backs. So as of late, he hasn't had the best schedule to match up with anyway. But now he's getting the New York Jets. And they are currently ranked 24th against the run, allowing the 7th most fantasy points to the running back position. Jerome Ford hopefully gets a few targets in the passing game and hopefully can break a few big plays this week. Now, we've seen a lot of passing from the Cleveland Browns recently, but this is a New York Jets defense that does a good job of limiting those big plays through the air. So is Joe Flacco going to be the guy once again, or is Cleveland going to need to find a way to get balanced and get Jerome Ford more involved in order to win this game? While Detroit and Dallas may both have playoff spots wrapped up at this point, there is still a big race for playoff seeding that still needs to be figured out in the NFC. The Lions, the Eagles, and the San Francisco 49ers all are 11-4. Dallas is 10-5. Who's going to win the NFC East? Who's going to be the number 1 seed? There is not going to be any starters sitting in this game for either team. David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs continue to be fantasy viable together. And maybe David Montgomery doesn't have the same ceiling that he had earlier in the season. It's okay, because Jahmyr Gibbs took that ceiling. That's the only reason why. Jahmyr Gibbs' playmaking ability is absolutely fantastic to watch. We haven't seen a running back do this in Detroit since Barry Sanders, and that's a huge compliment. It's not the same exact thing, but to watch Jahmyr Gibbs move and make people miss, he might be one of the best running backs in the NFL at doing that. This guy is going to be an absolute stud for the next several years for the Lions, and you can see why they were so excited to take him in the first round. And now he has got all of the fantasy upside that you need, even in a matchup going up against the Dallas Cowboys, where it could be a whole lot of throwing, a whole lot of offense, and a whole lot of back and forth action. Detroit's going to have to go on the road to Dallas, and I'm going to be willing to bet that one of the main parts of their game plan is going to be to run the football and keep the ball away from Dak Prescott, because Dallas, they do really well through the air, something Detroit has not done a great job of stopping. Dallas's defense has been very good this season as well, but they're all the way down to 19th against the run now. So running the football against them is absolutely going to be possible. But David Montgomery's ceiling will continue to rely on whether or not he scores a touchdown. We know if we get inside the red zone, David Montgomery is going to see some goal line carries. But Jahmyr Gibbs is starting to be used more and more in that aspect, and because of that, it's starting to really hinder what David Montgomery could do for us. And that's the reason why he's going to bring a decent amount of risk, because if he doesn't score that touchdown, a top 24 finish is going to be really difficult in this game. But for Jahmyr Gibbs, he's going to get the ball. He's going to get the ball a lot, and his big playmaking ability is going to allow some touchdowns to be scored. Once again, Jahmyr Gibbs will be inside my top 12. Since missing 2 games in weeks 5 and 6, Jahmyr Gibbs has finished as a top 6 running back in 6 of those 9 games. But for the Dallas Cowboys, keep in mind, just because a player is listed in red doesn't automatically mean that they're going to be a sit. But Tony Pollard doesn't have any type of a safe floor this week going up against the Detroit Lions. The Lions may struggle against the pass, but they absolutely dominate defenses, but they absolutely dominate offenses on the ground. They're currently ranked 4th against the run, allowing the fewest fantasy points to the running back position in 2023. And Tony Pollard has only finished as a top 12 running back twice since their bye in week 7. Over the last 2 weeks, he's finished as the RB 46 and RB 34. And even before that, he was barely cracking it inside the top 24 running backs. Tony Pollard is struggling right now, and it's not all his fault. It's the way he's being utilized. This offense doesn't use Tony Pollard in open space. They treat him like Derrick Henry. They're willing to just run him in between the tackles and try to find open spaces that way. We got to go to a zone run scheme here where we got to get him outside the tackles, and we got to find a way to allow him to dominate in open space. Until Dallas does that, he's not going to have a whole lot of upside, because that's how he made his huge plays the last couple of years when he started to become a fantasy viable player. For now, unfortunately, if you own him and you have better options, we're probably going to sit Tony Pollard this week. But unfortunately, if you own Tony Pollard, you probably don't have a whole lot of options anyway. For Miami and Baltimore, I'm going to call this matchup my Jekyll and Hyde matchup, because I really don't know if we know what we're going to get out of this matchup. It could be really good, it could be really bad, and honestly, it could change at any point during the game. Now for Raheem Mostert, he's one of the safest running backs in fantasy football this year. And even down the stretch run here where he's been a little bit banged up, even needing to leave last week's game for a few plays, he is a guy that has finished inside the top 24 running backs in every game but 2 this season. He might be the safest running back in football outside of Christian McCaffrey right now, which is absolutely crazy to say. Now, we know he has really good upside potential. The burst, the speed, the acceleration, everything can lead to some big plays. Now, Baltimore's defense is pretty darn good, and I don't know if those plays are going to represent themselves this week, but you can't sit Raheem Mostert. You can't even consider it, even if the matchup is tough. The guy leads the NFL in touchdowns right now, and he's absolutely one of the best bets to finish inside the top 24 outside of Christian McCaffrey at the running back position. Now, maybe his ceiling is a little bit lower than some of the other running backs this week, but we'll still toss him into our lineup, especially over a guy like Devon Achane, who fantasy owners were begging to get back as quickly as possible after he dealt with injuries earlier in the season. And when he did come back, he had to leave again right away. And then he came back the next week and he had a good game. After finishing as the RB4 in week 13 though, he hasn't sniffed the top 24. In fact, his utilization has almost completely disappeared, as Achane hasn't received 10 carries in a game since then. In a blowout win to the New York Jets, he only saw 9 carries. In close games against Tennessee and Dallas, he only saw 7 carries in those games. So game script wise, we're not even seeing a pattern right now. And he's not running for nearly the amount of yards that he did earlier in the year. Because earlier in the season, he wasn't getting 15 carries a game and putting up huge numbers. He was getting anywhere between like 8 and 11 carries per game and averaging well over 11 yards per carry. He hasn't sniffed that in the week since returning from injury. Could he still be a little bit banged up? Maybe. Could he be a little bit slower because of those things? Maybe. Maybe defenses have adjusted to him a little bit. But in championship week, seeing his last 3 weeks being nothing near what we need from fantasy viable starters, it's hard for me to even say that we can trust him a little bit going up against Baltimore. It's pretty simple for Gus Edwards though. If you're starting him, you're hoping for a touchdown because he's just not having huge fantasy volume performances. He's not having huge efficiency performances. He's scoring touchdowns. That's what he was doing really well at the midpoint of the season, scoring touchdowns. Now, he's gotten back to that over the last couple of weeks, but even with Keaton Mitchell being injured, he's not offering you the type of upside that you want to try and risk it with weekly in your fantasy lineup. Now, if you're trying to run with Gus Edwards this week, you're probably dealing with quite a few injuries or a running back position that has just been up and down for you all year long. But the Miami Dolphins allow the 5th fewest rushing yards and the 6th fewest fantasy points to the running back position. So for Gus Edwards this week, more than likely he's going to be a lot closer to a sit than he will be for a start for me. But if you're absolutely desperate, put him in your flex. Keep those fingers, toes, whatever else you need to do crossed, and hope that he finds the end zone. A lot of you may be super thankful for Zeke Elliott right now, who has offered up some fantasy viable performances the last couple of weeks here to help us through the playoffs. Some of you may be super upset with James Cook, who was absolutely balling out and then disappeared this past week. Over the last 4 weeks, Zeke Elliott has been inside the top 24 running backs 3 times. 2 of those performances inside the top 10. And it's not necessarily what he's doing on the ground that is helping fantasy owners, it's what he is doing through the air. And since Bailey Zappi took over as the starter here at the end of the season, he has targeted Zeke Elliott more than any player on the Patriots. For those of you in half PPR and especially full PPR leagues, Zeke Elliott is giving you a super safe floor right now. Over the last 4 weeks, he's averaging 7.5 targets per game. The workload in the passing game right now is more than enough to make Zeke Elliott not only a fantasy viable starter, but a really good RB2 player for all of you out there that are trying to win championships this week. Last week, James Cook struggled to get going on the ground, and the biggest reason why he didn't end up reaching even a safe floor for us is because he didn't even get 1 target in the passing game, an area that he had been utilizing utilized a little bit more over the several weeks prior to that. Now he's matched up with the New England Patriots, who are allowing the second fewest rushing yards in the NFL this season. However, he still has a shot at some decent upside. It just won't be on the ground. It's going to be getting him involved in the passing game once again. New England this year has allowed the 5th most receptions and the 7th most receiving yards to running backs. This is where James Cook needs to get involved to reach that ceiling that we've talked about. If we can get him 5 targets this week and he can catch at least 4 of those, then we put ourselves in a position to possibly find the end zone and maybe put together 50 plus receiving yards, allowing what little ceiling he has on the ground to be found in the passing game and giving us an overall decent floor. How do you feel this week trusting Bijan Robinson going up against the defense that has allowed the 2nd fewest rushing yards in the NFL this season? More than likely you wouldn't be feeling that great about it. But then you take a look at the fantasy points allowed by the Chicago Bears, and you have to wonder, where is it that they're getting beat by running backs, but they continue to stop them on the ground? Well, it's through the air. Because right now, the Chicago Bears allow the 2nd most receptions, the 2nd most receiving touchdowns, and the most receiving yards to the running back position on the season. They are having a very difficult time stopping running backs out of the backfield that can catch the ball. And Bijan Robinson may be one of the best in the NFL at doing that. But unfortunately, he plays for the Atlanta Falcons, and Arthur Smith, who really doesn't have a clue on how to put together a game plan focused on his studs to beat opposing teams. So this week, we're going to have to go ahead and just enjoy the ride with Bijan Robinson. The risk is going to be there. The dude could end up being a top 10 running back. He could end up being outside the top 24. We know that there's risk in starting him, but also knowing the fact that running backs make such a big difference in the passing game against the Chicago Bears would hopefully lead to me to believe that the Atlanta Falcons will get him involved in some capacity, because this isn't a game that the Atlanta Falcons can afford to lose. Chicago is playing much better down the stretch right now. Their defense is playing very, very well, and Atlanta still has a shot at the playoffs. But I'll tell you what, this is one of those losses that if Arthur Smith cannot figure out and get the win, could absolutely end up costing him his job. So I don't know. Maybe I would take a really poor performance from Bijan Robinson this week if it would mean that I don't have to deal with Arthur Smith anymore. Now, it's kind of opposite for the Atlanta Falcons, who are ranked 15th against the run, but allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points to the running back position. They'll give up some rushing yards, but they're really good at keeping opposing running backs out of the end zone and not allowing them to help through the air. Atlanta gave up their first rushing touchdown to a running back this past week. But we're really uncertain what's happening with the Chicago backfield right now, because last week D'Onta Foreman ended up missing the game due to personal reasons. And for Khalil Herbert, it felt like he had been really kind of tossed to the side over the few games prior to that. Roschon Johnson was seeing some more snaps, a little bit of an increased role, and D'Onta Foreman was still the lead back. And then against Arizona, Chicago said, nah, we got you all. Khalil Herbert's going to be the number one. And he ended up going off for an absolutely huge game against Arizona, and Roschon Johnson wasn't anywhere to be seen. So really, what does the usage matter at this point? This is a matchup that isn't going to be very good on the ground. And it's really hard to determine at this point who the starting running back or even the breadwinner is going to be in the backfield this week. So for me personally, I'm probably just going to stay away from the Chicago backfield altogether. At this point, we know the storyline with Derrick Henry this year. Games that are a positive game script or neutral game script for Tennessee, Derrick Henry is going to have a good day. He's going to perform well and give us really good fantasy viable numbers. Games in which Tennessee is in a negative game script, though, he's not going to have a good day. Tyjae Spears is going to see more snaps and more time on the field, even if he's not turning in fantasy viable performances to go along with it. But this week, going up against Houston, a team that Derrick Henry just played 2 weeks ago and may have had his worst probably his worst game ever, considering the fact that Derrick Henry has always been bigger, faster, and stronger than any opponent he's ever gone against in his entire life. This may have been his worst football game of all time. Because 2 weeks ago against this same Houston team, he ran for 9 yards on 16 carries. Houston's defense has been great against the run, and they absolutely shut down Derrick Henry a couple of weeks ago. Now, do I expect that same type of performance? No, I do think Derrick Henry will be better this week. But CJ Stroud could end up being back, and Houston could be a little bit more healthy for this game, which will be at home. So Derrick Henry is going to have to go on the road and try to put together a decent performance against an offense that could end up putting him down quickly. I just don't see it happening. He brings a lot of risk for me this week. Do I see him as a top 12 running back? No. Do I see him as a top 24 running back? If he can find the end zone, yes. But more than likely, Derrick Henry's range could be anywhere from like low-end RB2 to low-end RB3. More than likely, you're going to have to play him. But if you have any options that afford you more upside in your championship matchup, then this might be the first time in a long time that we have to discuss putting Derrick Henry on the bench. I didn't realize the Devin Singletary fan club had gotten so big. I mean, he was my RB30 last week, and people in the comments were adamant that Devin Singletary would be one of the safest running backs on the week. As it turns out, I was even a little too high on him because he finishes the RB36. Now, we already mentioned Derrick Henry in this same matchup a couple of weeks ago. That didn't turn out that well. But for Devin Singletary, it did because he ran for over 120 yards on 26 carries against this same Tennessee defense. Now, I do have to wonder maybe if Dameon Pierce sees a few more carries this week. He had that huge touchdown kickoff return this past week, and you got to wonder maybe he will see a few more carries, which could end up limiting Devin Singletary's upside. And he does bring a little bit of a risk for me because I don't think we really include Devin Singletary in those top must-start running backs every single week. But I'll have him inside probably the top 15 this week. Even if his ceiling isn't nearly as high as maybe what people will hope it will be, he should still have a pretty decent floor. Last week, Josh Jacobs didn't play, and Jonathan Taylor didn't play well. But that's not going to stop me from making this my Manscaped must-watch matchup of the week. Ladies and gentlemen, make sure you head on over to manscaped.com and check out all of their brand new products that they have on the shelf, especially some of their great beard products that I personally have been using like crazy. When you get ready to check out, just use code word headliners and you're going to get 20% off your entire order and free shipping. It really doesn't matter to me who the running back for the Las Vegas Raiders is this week. They're more than likely going to be in green. Indy allows the 5th most rushing yards and the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. If Josh Jacobs is able to go this week, he's going to be in green. It did sound like he was pretty close to going last week, but just wasn't able to get himself where he wanted to be. And now he's going to get a great matchup to come back to. If for some reason he can't go once again though, then Zamir White will end up also being in green. He's been a great fill in the last couple of weeks, and he didn't do a whole lot against the Kansas City Chiefs to start, but at the end of the game, a couple of big runs on that final drive there that sealed the game really helped push his fantasy numbers a little bit higher than what they were previously. But it will end up being a great matchup no matter what route we end up going this week, so hopefully if you own Josh Jacobs, you own Zamir White. The good news this week though is that Las Vegas plays in the early slot on Sunday, and there's only one game on Thursday and one game on Saturday, so we won't have to sit around guessing for the entire week whether or not we're going to have to start somebody before them or have to try and wait on them. We should know pretty early on with our lineup set what we're going to be doing. Now, Jonathan Taylor in his return from injury last week did not look great. He did score a rushing touchdown, the first time the Atlanta Falcons have allowed that this year, but volume-wise, it wasn't really what we would have wanted. But this matchup against the Raiders is going to be a whole lot better. The Raiders really are towards the bottom third when it comes to rushing yards allowed and fantasy points allowed to the running back position. They've kind of teetered in the middle a little bit, kind of fallen to the bottom third, back and forth. The defense, it really isn't that great against the run. There's a lot of opportunities. And Jonathan Taylor, I don't think anybody has realized just how good he has been in the games he's played this season. He's been a top 24 running back in every single game he's played this year, except his first one of the season. So Jonathan Taylor, if he's healthy and he's active, he's in your lineup. lineup because he's going to give you a top 24 floor. Now his ceiling, it's a little bit more up and down, but going up against the Raiders, it definitely has some top 12 potential baked into it. Chuba Hubbard now has 5 straight performances finishing inside the top 24 running backs. He hasn't been stellar. He hasn't been the sexy pick at the running back position over the last few weeks. But if you're someone that has owned Chuba Hubbard and have been utilizing him as like a flex option, he's been giving you pretty darn good numbers. This week against Jacksonville is going to bring some risk. Jacksonville can be good on the ground against running backs, even if it hasn't been spectacular over the recent weeks. So when you look at Chuba Hubbard, it's really kind of the same thing that we've seen from him recently. He's going to be right in that probably RB 17 to 24 range with a little bit of RB2 upside baked in if he's able to find the end zone. The biggest question mark in this matchup though is going to be Travis Etienne. And for those of you that rode him to fantasy dominance at the beginning of the season, you haven't gotten really anything over the last several weeks, especially the last 2 weeks. Now, based on his current performances, you would anticipate that he would not be listed in green here. But as of this recording, we don't even know if Trevor Lawrence is going to be able to play this week. And Carolina does a really good job of stopping quarterbacks and opposing wide receivers. If you're going to beat them, you're going to beat them with your defense and your run game. Jacksonville is going to have to heavily utilize Travis Etienne this week if they stand any chance of winning this game. And considering they're still in the lead for the division with Houston right behind them, this is as must win as it could possibly get. Because with a loss here falling to 500, they could go from leading the division to potentially being left out of the playoffs altogether. And I want to reiterate that this is not Travis Etienne's fault. This downfall in the second half of the season has been about Trevor Lawrence being injured, Christian Kirk being injured, inconsistencies in the offense, offensive line poor performance. There's a lot baked into this. Is some of it on Travis Etienne? Absolutely. There are some plays maybe where he could do some things a little bit different. But unfortunately, with all those things combined, he's really let us down here in the second half. But all of that could be forgiven with one more massive performance going up against Carolina this week to help us secure that fantasy championship. This matchup with the Rams and the Giants is actually the perfect storyline for what the big difference is in terms of volume and efficiency. And if you've been around the channel for a while now, you know how much I talk about efficiency and wanting running backs that are super efficient, and that even though volume is something that we look for in the running back position, volume isn't king. The same thing that a lot of people out there will try to sell you on. But look at the massive difference in Kyren Williams and Saquon Barkley. Kyren Williams has been super efficient this season. Saquon Barkley, not so much. And the discrepancy between the numbers that Kyren Williams is putting up compared to Saquon Barkley is a pretty massive difference. We're talking about an extra 7 fantasy points per week based on the amount of points that Kyren Williams is putting up with the same amount of volume Saquon Barkley is getting. Now, of course, the argument for that is going to be the fact that Kyren Williams plays with much better weapons around him than what Saquon Barkley does. And I get that, and it's completely understandable. But I thought this was a really good comparison to show you how much a running back with really good efficiency can be the game changer for your fantasy team. And in this matchup, Kyren Williams has an opportunity to be that game changer because we know he's going to get a ton of volume. We know that the Rams will more than likely be playing in a positive game script. And Kyren Williams, who has rushed for over 100 yards in 5 of his last 7 games, will once again have the upside that you're going to desire at the running back position. And more than likely will be locked in as my running back 2 once again this week. But for Saquon Barkley, his floor is really what we're looking at from a volume perspective. We know that he's going to be getting around 20 touches per game, and that's what makes him a safe start. That's what puts him in green, because the risk associated with Saquon Barkley isn't as high as a lot of other running backs. If you were to tell me, Kyle, you're going to be getting a running back with 20 touches this week, I'd be like, perfect, let's lock him into the top 24. So in terms of risk factor, Kyren Williams and Saquon Barkley have the same risk factor. They're both going to be guys that we can rely on putting in our lineup because we know they're going to get the volume and we know that they're going to create some fantasy points for us. But the biggest difference is the fact that Saquon Barkley isn't going to have nearly as high as a ceiling as what Kyren Williams will have, and that's where the rankings really come into play. We knew going into last week's matchup that James Conner was going to have a tough matchup on the ground against the Chicago Bears. And while we didn't see a whole lot from him on the ground, it was the passing game that propelled him to a top 10 finish this past week. And that's not something that you've heard me say too often this year. In fact, over the past few weeks, I've really talked about the fact that James Conner's usage in the passing game has been non-existent. This past week was the third time all season that he saw more than 4 targets in a game, and his 67 receiving yards is his highest total since week 3 when he had 18 receiving yards against Dallas. So his usage in the passing game, like I said, has been non-existent, and an extremely negative game script against Chicago this past week made it existent, which is crazy to think about because even in all the other negative game scripts that the Arizona Cardinals have faced all season long, they haven't utilized James Conner in this same way. So will the same thing happen this coming week against Philadelphia? Another tough matchup on the ground that's probably going to bring a really low upside with his just plain running ability, but potential upside if we can get him utilized in the passing game once again. It's really hard for me to bet on that though. We haven't seen it all season long. So while I'm willing to take the risk of starting James Conner this week, knowing that there is some top 24 potential with him, his floor could end up falling just outside the top 24 if he doesn't get those receptions. Against the New York Giants this past week, DeAndre Swift was able to find the end zone on the ground for his first time since week 11, which coincides with the fact that this was also the first time since week 11 that he has finished inside the top 24 running backs. Even with some really good matchups as of recent, we haven't seen the type of ceiling from him that he showed earlier in the year. Now going up against Arizona, that ceiling will absolutely be there once again. They continue to get absolutely torched on the ground. This Cardinals defense is allowing the most rushing yards and the most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So while we've seen a lot of up and downs from DeAndre Swift this season, this week against Arizona should bring a whole lot of ups. And if you've been relying on him and have been disappointed for a majority of the back half of this year, everything that we have needed from DeAndre Swift could come out in week 17 for our championship. Week 16 marks the first time all season that Alvin Kamara finished outside the top 24 running backs. But it also continues an unsettling trend of being outside the top 12 running backs all but one time since week 8. Alvin Kamara's issues recently are pretty simple. He continues to be really inefficient on the ground, and his passing game usage just isn't what it was at the beginning of the year. It's kind of crazy to think about, because not a whole lot has changed. In fact, the Saints have had issues staying healthy at the pass catching positions. And because of that, you would think that Alvin Kamara would see an uptick back to where he was earlier in the year, but it just hasn't happened. And now going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, it's not going to get any easier, allowing the 7th fewest rushing yards on the season and the 4th fewest fantasy points to the running back position. So unless you're going to tell me that we're going to lock in 8 or more targets for Alvin Kamara this week in the passing game, I have a hard time believing he has any type of a decent ceiling, because I don't think he's going to find a huge game on the ground out of nowhere in week 17 against one of the best run defenses in all of football. Be prepared this week to see one of Alvin Kamara's worst performances of the season. And unfortunately, last week, Rachaad White saw a little bit of a dip back to where he was in terms of efficiency earlier in the year. Now, that's just one performance, and Jacksonville has been good against the run at times this season. Now, with the lead that was built up by Tampa Bay, I would have loved to have seen a much better game than what we got from Rachaad White. but from a fantasy perspective, it still wasn't all that bad. Now the question is will he be able to score points against New Orleans this week? Because even though New Orleans is ranked 25th against the run right now, they allow the 8th fewest fantasy points to the running back position. And New Orleans does a really good job of limiting the areas that Rachaad White has used to increase his upside this season. Because right now they allow the fewest receptions to running back, and they allow the 3rd fewest receiving yards to running backs. They are also tied for the 5th fewest rushing touchdowns allowed to the running back position as well. So as we've talked about with Rachaad White this year, his receptions, his receiving yards, and his ability to find the end zone have really helped overshadow some of the efficiency issues that we've seen on the ground. And yes, even though he's been much better in that department as of late, the areas that he has used to help prop himself up are the areas that New Orleans is best at stopping. Back in week 4 when Tampa Bay played New Orleans, Rachaad White only had 55 rushing yards, was only able to find 22 receiving yards, and finished as the RB20 that week. Frankly, I'm going to be super honest with you all. There's not a whole lot of analysis to give you for this matchup. Why is that? Well, Christian McCaffrey, who is by far the #1 running back in all of fantasy football, is going up against a defense that by and large will probably allow a pretty big fantasy day for him. If you have Christian McCaffrey, congratulations. This is the perfect matchup that you would want, considering Washington just got beat up on the ground by Breece Hall and through the air as well. Now for the Washington Commanders. Really at the running back position this week, we really don't know what to expect. Brian Robinson has missed each of the last 2 weeks, and we don't know if he's even going to play this week or not. Antonio Gibson last week had an okay day on the ground, ended up scoring a rushing touchdown, but Chris Rodriguez ended up being the guy that overshadowed Antonio Gibson for the most part. So even if Brian Robinson were to return, is Brian Robinson going to get a majority of the workload? Will Chris Rodriguez see some touches still, given how well he's played the last couple of weeks? Is Antonio Gibson going to get the work that he needs? If Brian Robinson were to play, you're probably going to play him over anybody from Washington. But this matchup sucks. Let's be honest with you. Anybody that you try to play from Washington this week is probably going to have a super low floor anyway. So me personally, I'm just going to stay away from the team in general. If you've been waiting for Brian Robinson to come back this week, hopefully you have some better options for you, given the fact that Chris Rodriguez and Antonio Gibson could also see touches this week. But if you don't, throw him in there and just hope that maybe he can find you a big play or two. Even though he's more efficient, even though he's more explosive, even though he offers a better opportunity at big play potential, the Pittsburgh Steelers have decided that Jaylen Warren isn't worthy of playing more snaps than Najee Harris. Which is weird because big plays is something that Pittsburgh has lacked for what seems like a couple of years now. So for whatever reason, the 50-50 split that we saw from Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren a few weeks ago has essentially disappeared. And Najee Harris is getting a majority of the touches and snaps on the field now. And Pittsburgh feels like they're better off with that. Now, this matchup this week will present him an opportunity to potentially reach a decent ceiling. But even though he's in yellow and Jaylen Warren is in red, make no doubt about it, Najee Harris might be the safer running back of the two, but Jaylen Warren will continue to be the more explosive, higher upside play. And there's no stats that you can show that will change my mind. So if you want to play it safe this week, Najee Harris has the matchup to give you a really solid floor and potentially even score a touchdown. If you need points though, and you're really in a position where maybe you play like 2 flex spots, then Jaylen Warren might be a guy that could reach that potential for you and find himself inside the top 15. It would only take a couple of big plays to do it. But unfortunately, he's not going to have a better shot at the floor because Najee Harris will have the volume. Now, speaking of volume, that's Kenneth Walker's bread and butter right now. And he hasn't been nearly as efficient as we would like over the last couple of games, but we know that he can do it. And we know that he does offer some explosive plays. This past week, it felt like it was either big plays or getting tackled in the backfield. There was really no in-between for Kenneth Walker. And Kenneth Walker is seeing more snaps than Zach Charbonnet as well. Unfortunately, except for this past weekend when we were at a goal line stand at the end of the game, and myself and Jesse, who you all know on this channel as J Noise, are pleading for a Kenneth Walker touchdown to keep our parlay alive, and are blindsided by the fact that Zach Charbonnet is out there and not Kenneth Walker. But that's neither here nor there. No crying over spilt milk. Moving forward with Kenneth Walker over the next couple of weeks, really, it's going to be about saying, hey, he gets enough volume to be a top 24 running back. But unless he can get a little bit more consistent with the big plays, unless the offensive line can be a little bit more consistent, we're not going to see the ceiling that we would like to have. Kenneth Walker, okay, RB2, but I wouldn't be expecting any RB1 upside to finish the season. If you need a boost to your fantasy lineup and you own Javonte Williams or Austin Ekeler, then this is like the perfect matchup that you could think of, because neither of these defenses are really any that good at stopping the run. So if we're looking for upside, that could end up happening this week. Now, Austin Ekeler will have more upside than what Javonte Williams will. And Javonte Williams is coming off of a couple of pretty tough games, but I think he bounces back this week. In fact, the last time these two teams got together, Javonte Williams ran for 66 yards and scored a touchdown. And right now, his line over on Underdog is only 52.5 yards. Javonte Williams has faced some tough teams down the stretch, but I'm willing to bet against the Los Angeles Chargers. He's going to get back on the board this week, and he's going to hit that higher number, and 52.5 yards will lock us in for a nice little pick'em slip. And if you're interested in playing this pick'em, or if you're looking to redeem yourself from a poor fantasy season and you want to play some NFL playoff best ball, make sure you sign up on Underdog using code word headliners. They're going to match your deposit up to $100, and you're going to get a special pick'em only for our community that is almost guaranteed to hit. My hope is for Austin Ekeler and Javonte Williams this week that they both give you a really steady floor, putting them both well inside the top 24 and at least giving you RB2 production. But if we can get them headed towards the end zone and can find a touchdown for both of these guys, whether it be on the ground or through the air, then we could see some top 14 potential, and who knows, maybe both of them get back on track with a huge game. Here in the second half of the season, we've actually seen a little bit more upside from Joe Mixon than what we got at the beginning of the year. Now, that upside is largely in part to scoring a few more touchdowns, but it is interesting to note that the offense really was supposed to run through him when Joe Burrow went down, and Jake Browning said, hold a second, hold my beer, I'm going to come out here and I'm going to play this way. Now, this past week was not the best performance that you could have wanted from the Cincinnati Bengals, and there is going to be an opportunity for them to get back on track this week against Kansas City. But for me, it's a lot of the same thing with Joe Mixon. Floor-wise, RB2. Going to be right in that 24 to probably 17 range. Now, if he scores a touchdown, maybe gets a few looks in the passing game, we could see him start to creep up towards that top 12 status. But realistically, going up against Kansas City, especially if Cincinnati cannot stay with him for the entire game, we're going to have some issues finding a consistent workload for Joe Mixon. Really, the best bet, and we saw it at the end of the game going up against Kansas City, is to continue to pound the football against them, just like Las Vegas did, where Zamir White, towards the end of the game, was finally able to break off a couple of big runs. Now, Isaiah Pacheco would be locked in as a top 12 option, and he would be in green for me in this matchup. But he left last week with a concussion, and at this point, we're still not 100% sure if he'll be able to play this coming week. His helmet came off and he got kneed in the back of the head and was out for the entirety of the game after that. Keep an eye on that, though. If we hear more by Thursday when we do our rankings, we'll update it at that time. But unfortunately, for right now, we're going to have to play it safe because we don't know if he'll even be on the field. For the Green Bay and Minnesota matchup, these running backs are going to bring some risk for different reasons. For Aaron Jones, it's going to be the matchup. Minnesota has played very well against running backs this year, allowing the 9th fewest rushing yards in the league. But we do know by watching Jahmyr Gibbs and the Lions last week that they can get beat to the outside with a little bit of speed. And that's where Aaron Jones is really going to take advantage of you. Do I expect him to put together over 100 rushing yards like he did this past week? No, I do not. But I definitely think that if Green Bay can move the ball well against Minnesota, that Aaron Jones could potentially find himself with a red zone touchdown. Realistically, for Aaron Jones, I'm looking at something within probably the top 14 to 16 this week. Now for Ty Chandler, it's a really good matchup for him. And last week, even with Alexander Mattison being back, Ty Chandler was by far the lead back. And that could change. Detroit was a tougher matchup. They decided to roll with Ty Chandler, and he didn't really do a lot outside of scoring a touchdown. But that was a way tougher matchup than what Green Bay is. For me, Ty Chandler has the upside of a top 15 running back this week. But does Alexander Mattison get back to seeing more touches? Does he end up being the lead back this week? That's why Ty Chandler is still going to bring a lot of risk for me. Yo, Headliner Nation, hopefully you appreciate the analysis here for the running backs in week 17. Good luck to all of you, and make sure that you tune in on Thursday for the rankings episode to find out if anything has changed and to update you on maybe any injury issues that we talked about in this episode. For now though, I gotta go get tight ends done. Peace out, Headliner Nation. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.